inflation. I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about instead is the fact that peace is actually about reducing conflict. And if you look at the causes, the real causes of conflict throughout history, the ability to control resources, to be able to tax them, to support the power of a ruling authority is most commonly the reason for there to be war. I would suggest, and I've discussed this with academic historians who think there's a lot to that argument, we need to have strong tax systems which are internationally coordinated to make sure that we do not have war. So peace is a surprising element of the whole process of tax justice, and it motivates a lot of my work now. The work I'm largely doing on tax justice now is with actually three dens of the left, hotbeds of international socialism called the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the OECD. And I call them hotbeds of international socialism because there are very few other organizations in the world who are actually arguing so strongly for tackling inequality with tax. Governments are rarely doing so around the world, but they do, and I'm really pleased about that. And so I'm happy to work with them, even though, of course, those on the left have traditionally seen them as the enemies because they did so much work, which was harmful for a long time around the Washington Consensus. But the work I do now is heavily about how we create tax systems to coordinate with each other to try and eliminate this friction which creates stress. At the same time, underpinning that, of course, there is the issue of equality. And again, I'm working with an organization now mostly called the Global Initiative for Financial Transparency, which of course will come to truth in a second. But the Global Initiative for Financial Transparency, what we're looking at is how can we actually make sure that tax systems are designed so that people don't end up in that position that Janie just talked about, where the system is biased against the poor who cannot be represented by an accountant, who have no means of understanding how the system really works. How can we make sure that it works well for everyone? And so we're looking at and creating guidelines for tax systems and tax system design, both within and between states, to try and make sure that we can deliver equality, but also to highlight where there are stresses, where there are opportunities for abuse. They're very clearly available in the UK. I mean, it is quite absurd that the income from investment income in the UK is taxed much lower than income from work. How much lower? Over 20% on average lower. I mean, this is just a gross injustice. It is absurd that you get 2 personal allowances if you're wealthy enough to enjoy capital gains in the UK, but only 1 if you can only actually earn a living. It is crazy that you get double the amount of tax relief for putting money into your pension fund if you're rich than you do if you're on a lower income. Why should we subsidize the savings of the rich at twice the rate of the savings of those on low income? Many, many things make little sense in terms of equality. So the work we're doing there, backed by the OECD, say, and IMF and World Bank, has come to the point of really highlighting this point of equality. Simplicity is a key element of this. One of the reasons why tax justice worked, and I think it's important to say why I think it worked, because frankly, there was no reason why it should have done. There were very few of us. We got the aid and development agencies behind us. We needed people who would actually shout on our behalf as a tiny organization. And we got Christian Aid, Oxfam, Action Aid, and many other agencies across Europe and elsewhere to actually become basically, and it's a not very Quakerly term, but it's one that my colleague John Christensen used, become our tanks on the lawn. And it was, they were the mechanism that we used to get mass persuasion. They were the people who took some of the ideas that we focused on in tax justice. And I have always done this, and I would actually say I've probably done more of this than most people in tax justice. We look to try to find solutions, and simple solutions that could work. So when, for example, we looked at tax havens, we said, well, there's a solution to this. We need information to be transferred from tax havens to countries like the UK, the US, France, Germany, and so on, about who uses these places. And they were looking at the most incredibly complicated schemes in the OECD. And so I designed a very simple scheme. That simple scheme is effectively in operation now, are in about 90 countries around the world. Most tax havens are remarkably transparent now. In fact, it is easier for HM Revenue and Customs to get information on a bank account that I hold in Georgetown, Cayman Islands, than it is to get information on a bank account I hold in Ely in Cambridgeshire. It is that absurd, because actually the information exchange from Georgetown, Cayman Islands is actually better than it is very often within the UK at present. So we designed systems that would work. I also designed a system called country by country reporting. I looked at the problems of multinational companies, which we were highlighting, all those companies that really didn't like me very much, Google, Amazon, and Starbucks, and so on, because I helped create all those stories and helped work closely with Margaret Hodge on their exposure through the House of Commons. But I created a system called country by country reporting. It's a simple accounting system. I simply applied my professional skills. This is why Quakers in Business Act is important, to bring our skills into the public domain. And what I did was just said, what information do I need to work out which companies are allocating their profits inappropriately to tax havens? And using 7 pieces of data: turnover, profits, number of employees, pay of employees, and assets allocated to various resources, I could come up with formulas which would literally come up with a formula which showed the profit allocated to a tax haven is inappropriate to the level of activity taking place there. The most extreme example we ever found was Barclays, when they first published this data required by European law in 2013. Every employee of Barclays in Luxembourg made £94 million of profit each a year at that time. Every employee in the UK made a loss of £27,000 a year. There were 55,000 employees in the UK who managed to make a loss, and 14 employees in Luxembourg who made much more profit than was ever lost in the UK. Did that imply that Barclays might have been recording their profits in the wrong place? Yes, it did. This mechanism called country by country reporting, I spent a long time in Paris negotiating with the OECD in an international arena. I never expected doing this work would actually end up at the point where one day I would sit in one of those enormous meeting rooms you see at international conferences, where there's sort of all these countries sitting around with their, their little microphones and their name boards for their country and their name boards which they put upright when they want to speak. And there were 40 countries in the room. And the fourth side of the table was for the person making the presentation. And it turned out that I was the rest of the world that morning. And I turned to the single colleague who sat next to me, more for moral support. He said, well, I don't know anything about this. This is your show, Richard. I'm not going to say a word. You're on display here for the next 2 hours. You're making the case. And I said, who gave me the authority to speak for the rest of the world? And he said, have faith, Richard. And at that moment, I actually thought, okay, this is the moment for 30 seconds of silence, because you're going to need it, boy. Because you're going to go and bat for the rest of the world to see if we can beat tax havens. And 2 hours later, the US delegate told me, I think I agree with you, Mr. Murphy. And at coffee, the head of the OECD, who only retired at the end of October, who was still in function, and we spoke on the 31st October, he and I, because we've become friends. And we're going to carry on that friendship afterwards, after he's left the OECD. But he actually came to me at coffee and said, you've won, that's it. Now, I didn't expect as a Quaker to go from literally this itch, there's something I must do, to this point of we're going to deliver it. But simplicity was at the core of the design. And because I made it simple, curiously, it worked. Don't think complexity is the answer to every problem, is the point I'm making here. We have to find ways to find solutions which work. And finally, there is, of course, truth. And I'll mention truth because it matters to me enormously. I'm deeply offended by people who don't tell the truth. There is nothing, and my sons will confirm this, there's nothing you can do to me which offends me more than lying. The only time I get annoyed with them is when they tell me something which is not true. Whatever trouble you've got into, whatever you've done, tell me the truth. I don't mind the truth, but I do mind you lying about it. And that's true everywhere. And I hate people who don't tell the truth to the revenue. I hate people who don't tell the truth in their accounts. I hate people who actually try to hide the truth by misrepresenting what's going on in tax havens, you name it. I am really not keen. So one of the key features of tax justice was Tell us the truth about what you're doing. And that made us very, very deeply unpopular, particularly with the big four firms of accountants for a long time. They told me I was an idiot. They told me I didn't know what I was talking about. They told me it was impossible to deliver country by country reporting. It could never be done. I pointed out that if it couldn't, and they didn't know where their clients were undertaking their transactions, they actually were in breach of the law to maintain proper books and records for the companies in which they were preparing audit reports, and they should be qualifying them as a result. That shut them up for a while they thought about that one, it has to be said. It helps to actually know their own game. I mean, I was a qualified auditor for many years. But at the end of the day, actually, it turned out everything that we said was possible, and it is now done. It is the law in 90 countries to provide accounts on this basis that I designed in 2003. So why? I mean, that's why I think Quaker principles underpin this work, and I have deliberately framed it in that way. But actually, when I look back on the work, I think, frankly, I couldn't have put it in a better way than that. And it's why I put it in that book. And it's why I still think it's relevant this morning, because we did try to reduce inequality. We did try to create mechanisms to reconcile conflicting objectives, which is peace. We have definitely looked at how we can make things easier and better. And truth underpins everything we've done. At the core of it, then, we can translate this also into actually thinking about how we run businesses, and I'm going to speak for only another couple more minutes at most, and how we run businesses can actually reflect those principles as well. Because in my way of thinking, a business is, of course, about, in a Quaker sense, and I've run many businesses. I mean, I think I've been a director of more than 10, employed quite a lot of people. I can see somebody's desperate trying to get hold of me from St. Helier, Jersey at the moment, which is really interesting. My phone has actually got a phone call coming in from the place where I'm an enemy of the state. I wonder what I've done to upset somebody this morning. Anyway, a Quaker business should be not about profit maximization. I don't know how to profit maximize. I'm an economist, I'm an accountant. I couldn't profit maximize. I couldn't tell you what my demand curve was. I couldn't tell you what my supply curve was. I can't tell you what my marginal costs are. And I don't know what my customer's marginal revenue position is. So therefore, I can't possibly actually profit maximize in the sense that an economist talks about. It's complete nonsense, which is why I'm a political economist, not an economist. But as an accountant, I also know that we should not be maximizing profit. And if clients used to come into my firm and say, I want to set up a business, I want to maximize profit, I always showed them the door and said, you're not my type of client. What do you want to do to serve a community well, for which they will wish to pay you, from which you may make a surplus, which we will then worry about the tax on? If that's what you want to do, I'm happy to help you. And that was my firm's ethos. And it worked very well. We ended up with a lot of clients by working that way and never doing tax avoidance. The point is, it's also about telling the truth throughout that entity as well. Telling the truth to yourself, incredibly important. Telling the truth to your staff, to your suppliers, to your customers, to your stakeholders in the broader society. Actually saying, I make a contribution. And here, tax justice is about simply saying, I'm making a contribution, putting it in your accounts and saying what you pay. And I think that's vital as part of the process, because at the end of the day, it's about good governance. And I think Quakers in Business is partly about good governance, how we understand the priorities in our organizations. What are we here to do? How do we add value? What is that added value to society? And paying tax is part of it. And to me, that is what tax justice is all about.
Thank you.